today you will be safe. Offer your
I don't know that there's a natural peak for the coronavirus, but it also depends on our policy response.
Obviously, there are no GDP growth numbers out, but is there a general consensus amongst economists that we are headed towards a recession?
So there's definitely a consensus among economists that we're in a recession already, but the range of estimates for how bad that recession is are as broad as I have ever seen them. So I should say we have these really sophisticated macroeconomic forecasting models that we use to figure out GDP forecasts. And there's no line in them for pandemic. So we're all pushing on different parts of the model as we can with virtually no good economic data, hard economic data for what the implications of the virus have been on the economy. So far, according to the Bloomberg consensus surveys, the range of estimates for the second quarter of GDP in the US on an annualized basis is negative 0.6% to negative 40%. So that's huge. And really anything in between is plausible. I would err towards the more pessimistic side of that. So I think we're probably closer to negative 40% in the second quarter than we are negative 0.6%. But it just gives you an indication of how much uncertainty there is among economists. We got out a few hard data points. Today, actually, we saw retail sales and industrial production in the US, and they're worse than we've ever seen them. So it seems like the engines have kind of fallen off the economy. And we know that we're on quicksand. We just don't know where the bottom is. We can't even see it, even as we know we're not there yet. And so it's difficult to guess how deep the recession will be or what the shape of the recovery might look like.
So this week, 80 million Americans are expected to receive these one-time deposits called economic impact payments over the next week or so. But are we going to see a significant impact from that? Senator Cory Booker said that we have to make a more long-term strategy in place, and that needs to be discussed. So are we going to see an impact from these payments?
So these checks aren't very targeted. They're to everyone who's paid their taxes, who makes under $75,000 a year, and their kids in some cases. And the reason that we didn't make them targeted is that we have really top-down tools for trying to ferret out all the people who most badly need money in the economy, and top-down tools just aren't really a good way to do that. And there was a sense that, we've had so many people file for unemployment. So many people have lost their jobs. It's kind of the vulnerable hourly service workers who have been hit immediately and the hardest. So we needed to get assistance out there. And even if some people got a check who didn't need it, then when the recovery hits, maybe they'd be able to spend it and that would boost the recovery. So it wouldn't be, for nothing. So I do think that these checks are useful in just quickly getting money out to people who desperately need to make rent payments, pay for food, pay for medical expenses. Do they go far enough? Absolutely not. At the beginning of our thinking of a policy response, the real plan was to just try to put the economy on ice for about 2 months and give everyone bridge loans to get through those 2 months until the economy could open back up again. Now I think we're starting to realize it's going to take longer than 2 months for us to actually reopen the economy. And so those most vulnerable in our society are going to need a whole lot more support. We're not actually just seeing that on the individual side. If we look at the small business loans that are being given out to encourage small businesses to keep the lights on and also keep people on their payrolls, we've seen a lot of them have already been applied for. So we're out of money pretty much already, and the program hasn't been in effect for that long. So we've had 3 fiscal packages passed by Congress already. We're sure there will be a 4th. It's already being discussed, but there may be more after that. We'll definitely need more support.
So according to Vox, the Dow Jones rose the same day the Department of Labor announced about 3.3 million Americans lost work in a single week. So what economic indicators should we be focusing on to give us a better representation of what our economy actually looks like?
So I would say there are often huge dichotomies between what economists and investors are saying. And that doesn't mean that either one is wrong, actually. So it seems really dystopian that as we're reporting that all these people are unemployed, the markets are soaring. But I think the markets were soaring not based on the unemployment data, it was based on all the accommodation that the Federal Reserve has pushed into the markets and the economy. And that's not necessarily wrong. And so I think actually the labor market is one of the first things we should be looking at. The labor market data comes out pretty frequently and is often not revised that significantly, so it's reliable and frequent. And particularly if you're looking at a huge collapse in the economy in just a matter of weeks, looking at jobless claims, which come out every week, is really helpful. We should also be looking at consumer confidence to see how people are feeling about the economy, about their future, about purchases. And so that's an indicator you can look at. It comes out once a month generally. I'm looking at retail sales to see how much people are actually spending their money is useful. Retail sales came out today. It was worse than we've ever seen it. So that's a good indication that there's just been an absolute hard stop in spending for a lot of consumers outside of things like groceries, which have obviously seen a big spike. So that's useful as well. And I'm focusing so much on the consumer because the consumer accounts for 70% of our growth in the US. So without the consumer, we don't really have any growth. But you can also look at some indicators for businesses. There's business confidence you can look at. There's business loans, which you can look at just to see how much activity there is. That gives an indication of how much businesses are planning to spend or invest as well. That's obviously being boosted right now by the fiscal programs that we have, but that's already helpful. And you can look at things like industrial production, which shows how much we're actually producing. And again, that fell off a cliff today. So we know that the economy is not doing well, but that's not really a surprise to economists. One other thing you can look at in indicators, but also out your window is new car sales. So that comes out pretty regularly. It's pretty easy to follow. And if your neighbor has a new car in his driveway, then that's a sign that actually we know where the bottom is and we're probably back on the upside again.
So thousands of students will be graduating from university or already have graduated, and they're graduating into some of the worst unemployment that we've seen in decades. But the president says that we're going to rebound on the other side. Are there indications of this, or is this false hope?
So unfortunately, I think it's pretty unlikely that we'll rebound in the way that the president has indicated. We'll recover at some point.
Yes.
I mean, this health crisis is temporary. And a lot of it is dependent on epidemiology and not economics at all. But if we can contain the virus, then we can begin to recover. A lot of economists had really hoped for a V-shaped recovery, so a really sharp fall in activity. But then once we contain the virus, all this pent-up demand will be released and we can go back to life as normal. I think we're starting to realize that that's very unlikely for a couple reasons. One is that in this downturn, even as we've tried to get aid to individuals and small companies that really need it, it's taken us a while to actually disperse the money. And so a lot of those businesses in particular have just gone under in the meantime. So when we start up the economy again, we're going to be starting from a partial standstill. Some of those businesses will have to set up again. New businesses will be set up. It's not just a question of freezing the economy and defrosting it and letting those businesses get back to life as normal. Secondly, I think, life as normal just won't exist for us anymore, at least until we have a vaccine. So the idea that, well, I'll just go out again and resume normal activities, that's really unlikely now. If we were to do that, we would see a spike in new cases. We'd basically be brought right back to where we were on March 1st, since most of the population hasn't gotten this virus yet, so most of us don't have immunity. And that just means that as we open up the economy and people are let out, there's going to be a spike in cases. We'll be locked back down again until the new cases fall, and then we'll be out again, let out again. And so we're going to have this intermittent isolation, and that doesn't really speak to a swift recovery. That means it's going to be a real stop-start process. So unlike the V-shaped recovery that the president had been touting before, I think we're more likely to see kind of a Nike swoosh, where the back end of that is really zigzagged rather than a straight line as we open up and close the economy. There's one other option, well, short of getting a vaccine, there's one other option that's actually better and cheaper probably, and that's to just test like mad. So an economist called Paul Romer has put forth this proposal, which suggests that if we test everyone every 2 weeks, then we'll know who has it and we can go ahead and isolate them. And everyone else can just go back to life as normal. And we would have confidence in that because we're testing everyone every 2 weeks, which is roughly the incubation period for the virus before you get symptoms. Now, that sounds like a great idea, but it requires testing about 150 million Americans a day. And right now, we can't even test 1 million Americans a day. So it would require a massive ramping up of testing. Resources would be needed to do that. You know, the politics would have to get behind it. And so far, that just looks really implausible, unfortunately. That being said, you know, every week in this crisis is like a light year. So things change really quickly. And so in a couple of months, might we actually get there? We've put a man on the moon, so you'd like to think we could maybe figure out testing. But so far, it just doesn't look like that's going to be a short-term solution.
So to pivot more globally now, Angola, Gabon in Africa, Pakistan, Afghanistan in Asia, these are governments, their governments are wary to lock down because of how precarious the economic situations are there. The Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan said, if we close down the country, what will happen to the poor? So how do you balance, you know, the economic health and then the physical safety of your citizens for countries that are more precarious economically?
Yeah, so I think unfortunately these kinds of isolation tactics that we've used in the developed world just don't work as well in a lot of emerging markets. So, you know, how do you engage in social isolation and social distancing in a Soweto township? You just can't. There are too many people in too close proximity. And so even if there are efforts to force a lockdown in some of these economies, I think what you'll see is you're just going to see the virus kind of rip through communities. And that means that, you know, if our health services in the US are being overwhelmed already, the health services in emerging markets will be completely overwhelmed, and you'll end up with a lot of casualties, unfortunately. It also means that more people will get immunity. So ironically, on the back end of this, you know, emerging markets might have more casualties, but they might end up with herd immunity much faster so that they can resume normal activity at some point. In the West, we've decided that's not worth the cost. In emerging markets, they might not have that choice. I'd also say that emerging markets have kind of been hit by this crisis in the opposite way that we have in the US and in Europe, where in the US and Europe, we were hit by the health crisis first, and then it spread into the economy, and then it spread into financial markets. In emerging markets, it's doing exactly the opposite. So first it hit in the financial markets. As the dollar got more expensive, it made it much harder for emerging markets to pay their debt that's denominated in US dollars. All kinds of investors pulled money out of emerging markets that made borrowing costs go up for governments and companies in emerging markets, just making it much more difficult for them to operate. That spread into the economy. And now slowly we're starting to see the virus really hit emerging markets outside of China, of course, because this all began in China. But that means that the idea that we're going to have this globally synchronized recovery just can't hold water. As the US and Europe have finally flattened the curve and are starting to talk about opening up their economy, emerging markets are really just starting to get the full force of the actual virus. And so they'll be locked down as we're coming out of it. So that means that it's going to be really difficult to rebound quickly.
And then this week, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Russia, they all signed the OPEC Plus agreement. But one Goldman Sachs analyst called this quite underwhelming because Canada, the US, Norway, they had not agreed on paper to anything yet. So how significant is the reduction in oil production, and are we going to see an impact on the global economy?
So the reduction in oil production will help partially address the supply side of what's going on in the oil market. So what we've seen in the oil markets is that we've been hit by both an increase in supply, as Russia and Saudi Arabia decided that they would flood the market with oil. And we also at the same time have been hit with a massive collapse in demand as world economies are all coming to a screeching halt, right? And so this deal to kind of curb supply of oil, that deals with the supply side. It does absolutely nothing to address the demand side of this. And so even with this deal, you might see oil prices increase a little bit, and that's good for oil producers. But it's not going to increase to where it was before, certainly. So oil prices are still going to be pretty low. And that's a real challenge for a lot of emerging markets who rely on oil and other commodities for exports. And also, they tend to sell that stuff in US dollars, so it gives them dollars to pay off their dollar-denominated debt, for example. So I think this could increase oil prices a little bit, certainly not enough to get back to where we were before. And for the US, there are implications because we have the shale industry. And the shale industry was already struggling with oil at $50 a barrel. It was completely untenable for the shale industry to survive with oil at $20 a barrel. Now, if oil goes up to around $30, $35 a barrel, helps a little bit, but if the entire shale industry in the US was struggling with oil at $50 a barrel, $35 a barrel is way too low. And so I do think that we're going to end up seeing a lot of these companies go under. We're going to see a lot of consolidation on the oil patch in the US.
Okay, and then just finally, in the NPR article where you were interviewed, you talked about work sharing. Mm-hmm. So how successful has work sharing been, and where can it be implemented elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, so work sharing is a mechanism that's been used in Germany and the Netherlands in the past really successfully, particularly during the global financial crisis. And the idea is that instead of laying people off, you just cut their hours so that they're working part-time. And the company pays for the hours that they're actually working, but then they can go ahead and apply for unemployment insurance or get tax rebates, all from the government, for the remaining hours that they're no longer working. So they're still getting paid, but it's not all coming from the company. So that reduces the burden on these companies who are going through a difficult time as well. Importantly, it keeps people on the payroll. So if you think about your first week or two in a new school or a new job, you spend all your time figuring out what's going on, where the restroom is, how to get onto your email. You're not productive at all, really. And so this is avoiding that whole process by keeping people who work there still attached to the company, so that when you get through a crisis, you can find the other side, ramp back up production. You have all your skilled workers. You don't have to retool them. You don't have to introduce them to your culture, any of those things. The downside of it is that it's pretty expensive. It's pretty expensive mainly for the government, who takes on a lot of these payments to guarantee people's salaries. So this has been the European approach. So far, it's been pretty successful. You've kept a lot of people who are still employed. In the US, we've taken a totally different approach, which is to just allow people to be laid off or furloughed. So they're attached to the company kind of, but they're not working and they're not getting paid, and they can apply for unemployment insurance. And so instead of guaranteeing people's salaries, our government has decided to beef up unemployment insurance. So they've made the pot of money that those who are unemployed can apply for much bigger. And so the downside to that is that when we get to the other side, maybe companies can still find their old employees and hire them back. But in some cases, people move and won't have updated their contact details. So there's some frictions there. And it also means that when we ramp back up, you're going to have to hire new people, reskill them, retool them, go through that painful 2-week process where no one actually gets any work done as they're trying to figure things out. The bonus of that is it's cheaper over the long term. So, which approach is better, that really depends on how long this crisis lasts. If this really is a temporary crisis, then the European approach, work sharing, I think is much more effective. If this lasts a lot longer, if it takes us a long time to contain the virus, if it mutates, then actually the US approach might be better. One other thing is that a lot of industries that we have had in the past are probably just never coming back. So movie theaters might change a lot of retail, bricks and mortar stores that we're just never going to go back to. We're going to do all our ordering online going forward. If you engage in work sharing, then you're keeping people in those jobs, even though on the other side of this, they're never going to work in those jobs again. And so that's creating rigidities in your labor market that aren't that helpful. So the US approach of just letting people go, they can apply for other jobs elsewhere. If they get them, great. If not, then maybe they're still attached to their old employer and can find them later. That gives you much more flexibility when a recovery does finally start.
All right, that's it from me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.